أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين، وبعد. So inshallah, this book, the way I would like to conduct this class is that just make a very, very brief introduction, and I will ask one of the brothers to read, and then there will be some analysis of the text. So the comment, and I'm saying, yes, inshallah. So this is the text that we'll be using. It's a bit of a heavy text that needs a bit of dissection. So inshallah we'll do that. First of all, we need to understand the status of ul-Tafseer, right? The status of ul-Tafseer in the pyramid of other Islamic sciences. So can I free myself from this? Just to write something. Oh, there is no board. In the board? So the way Islamic sciences work, is we have text, isn't it? We have text. The texts that are sacred in Islam are the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? The definition of the Quran is known and the definition of Sunnah is known. But then, so these texts stand at kind of the pinnacle of Islamic knowledge. These texts happen to exist or to be produced, right? Let's use that word, to be produced, the Quran being revealed and the Sunnah being said in a context, isn't it? Historical context, isn't it? So the Sunnah and the Quran were revealed both in historical context. But even though they were revealed in historical context, their meaning is not historical. It is trans-time and trans-place, right? Now, at the time when these texts were produced, at that historical context, those who were available at the time, they did not need to understand the historical context because they were part of it. So that was not a problem. But there was another problem, which is two things, two challenges. One was understanding, because people vary in their understanding. Some are quick, some are slow. Some are smart, some are not. So some had to make inquiries. What does this text mean? Even though the context was the same. So when the Prophet ﷺ, for example, recited to the Sahaba the ayah, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ, eat and drink until the white thread and the black thread are both distinguished. Some Sahaba didn't need to ask further because they understood right away what it meant. But somebody else went and he brought black thread and white thread, put it under his pillow, and he kept taking. Remember, in those days there was no lights, there was nothing. So the house is really dark. So he keeps taking them out and seeing, when can I see them distinguished from one another? He couldn't. So he kept eating and eating and eating and eating until the whole house was lit by daylight. And he went to the Prophet and said, look, I ate all the way through the day. And he said, what did you just do? He said, I literally applied what the verse told me to do. It said, eat and drink until you could see the black and the white thread so distinguished from each other. So there was a challenge of what? understanding. And then there was another challenge, which is what? The challenge of language. What do we mean by challenge of language? All Arabs spoke proper Arabic. Yes, they did. But remember that dialectical Arabic was variant across Arabia. Some Arabs did not understand what the Quran says because they were from a completely different location. If a Qurayshi says something and another person understands it, he might understand it in accordance to his dialect. So these were two levels. Therefore, the Prophet ﷺ assigned the explanation of the text to some people, but not to other people. So amongst the Sahaba, there were people who gave what? Tafseer. And there were other Sahaba who just listened to what these Sahaba had to say. So not everyone who was at the historical context said, okay, let me roll up my sleeves, I'm going now to give tafsir of the Quran. No. The reality is there were students and teachers, even amongst the Sahaba. People who gave tafsir and people who just were there to receive. Because of what? This has nothing to do with them being Sahaba. That's a different story. This has something to do with qualification. Qualification and personal integrity, intellectual integrity and personal integrity are two separate things. You might find a person who is very righteous, very good person, but he doesn't know anything. He just knows the fardul ayn. You can ask this person for dua, but you can't ask him a fatwa. You can ask him for dua, but you can't ask him what? A fatwa. Sure. So we shouldn't confuse the lines. Now this text was revealed in what? In a historical context. What has happened with the years is both the level of understanding went down, the level of language went down. The language to the Arabs, even those who were well versed in language, was something called malaka, talent. It's a second nature. You grow up in an English-speaking country, you pick up English as a spoken English, but it doesn't mean you can understand Shakespearean English. Why? Because that is language taught, it's not language spoken. You can pick up the street language and people can talk to you. But if you go and read a book, it will be a different thing. So those people had the talent of language, but even in that, they were not equal. They were not equal in understanding. They had the historical context, but not all of them either, because there were Sahaba who visited the Prophet only once in their lifetime. There were Sahaba who have just seen him passing by, and that's it. So they didn't even have a chance to attend the revelation of one ayah, or even the statement of one hadith. Right? Again, personal integrity and intellectual integrity are two different things. Now, there was a decline in language, decline in understanding, because understanding and language are related. And then there was a decline in the historical context, because we have departed from the historical context in two ways. We are far from the historical context of the text in two ways. Way one, distance-wise. We don't live in Arabia. We did not exist at the time. And secondly, cultural-wise. There are certain things that the ayat talk about which are completely alien to us. I don't understand. Even if I see it, I'll say, what is this? Culture practices are not only strange because they are distant, but because it's not justifiable to you. Why do we have, for example, why do we have a big problem with slavery? Part of the problem is we don't understand the context, the social context in which slavery has existed. I had a conversation with someone from Mauritania where slavery was commented recently, and he himself witnessed slavery firsthand. When he explained things, it made a completely different understanding to me. People, for example, this is not a justification of anything, but for example, a master, as much as he had the privilege, we only talk about slavery in a privileged way, as much as he had the privilege of all of this access, but he had to pay zakah on behalf of his slaves. Right? So that's financial burden. He had to make sure that his slaves are comfortable wherever they are. So we are distant from the historical context, physically and also intellectually. Right? Now, what has happened, the ulama started to synthesize, to put together means of understanding the text. So they said, first of all, let's build the language. This is the first thing. The content of the Quran, the medium in which the Quranic concepts are delivered is Arabic. So let's build Arabic. So if someone doesn't know how to speak Arabic, he's below here. If someone knows how to speak Arabic, he's here. He knows. Now, that's like a colloquial English, slang English. So we have to teach him first, or her, first, proper English. The language in which Arabic, the language in which people can have an intelligible, proper, sane, and respectful conversation, and then teach them the language in which the text was revealed. The Quran was revealed not just in Arabic, but in the Arabic that was common in the Jahili time, in the pre-Islamic time. That's a whole different thing. So how are we going to teach someone the Jahili language? They have to memorize poetry, isn't it? Because that was the language that people used to talk to each other, to express and to write about their days and their nights and their happiness and their sadness and their pride, isn't it? So we started teaching people a group of sciences, which we call ul-Lugha, including derivation. Where do words come from? Then morphology. What's morphology in Arabic? Sarf, how words are constructed. And then grammar. Nahu, how sentences are constructed. And then something called wada'. What is wada'? How words relate to meanings. How words relate to meanings. If I use this word, for example, ma. What does ma refer to? What's the meaning of it? Kul. What does kul refer to? And so on and so forth. So this is a whole plethora of things. And also, we had to go, this is just language. And then we had to go to another level of use. Use of language. Now this is just building language. Then use of language. I don't use language at the same level all the time. Sometimes I use language to refer to literal meanings, haqa'iq, isn't it? So what I say relates to what I mean identically. Or it is used as what? Metaphor. That's called what? Balagha, isn't it? Sometimes I use little amount of words for big meanings, and sometimes too many words for little meaning. Sometimes it's detailed, sometimes it's summarized. So this is ijaz, or itnab, right? Summation or precision and expansion. And then all of that, and we haven't just come out of what? Of language. Then you go to something, now you look at the way the Quranic language is constructed, and then the language of the Quran is used, the way it is used, and then you go to Usul al-Fiqh. Usul al-Fiqh, which are the method. Okay, I now have the tools, but part of the tool is what? Is a manhaj, is a method, so that I go for a bigger methodology that govern my way of dealing with the ayat of the Quran, so there is consistency. So there is Usul al-Fiqh. And then I go to what? I go to historical contexts. When I go to historical context, which is sometimes called Asbab al-Nuzul, isn't it? So that I will not clash the ayat, because I don't know when were they revealed. I don't see an ayah saying something and an ayah saying something else, and I just clash them and I say there is contradiction, right? So with this in mind, we can easily say that tafsir, once we do all of this, we arrive here at the text. What do we do at the text now? Explain the text, isn't it? Or interpret the text. I'll explain the text if it is very literal, or interpret it if it's metaphorical, or so on and so forth. I will try to and in order to do this, I have to have all of these tools. And at the end, when I do this, what do? I acknowledge that in this whole attempt, I did my best. So if I failed to say what the text meant, that's fine. I did my best because I tried to understand this text, which is distant from me culturally and in terms of locality and historically and so on and so forth. So with this in mind, where can we place tafsir? We can say that tafsir is on the pinnacle of Islamic sciences, right? Before we do it, we should go through what we call the ancillary knowledge. The ancillary knowledge is the tools with which we can open and close, with which we can remove, assemble and disassemble. These ancillary sciences, if someone is deprived of them, so someone doesn't have any of this, right? And he just came, he doesn't even have Arabic language. So he picked up the translation of the Quran by Abdul Halim, right? And then he said, look, this ayah means this and this ayah means that. We say to that person, excuse me, you lack the very basic tool that enables you, that gives you access to this. Go and learn and then come and do tafsir. But if you are jumping to tafsir, it will be like that. It's the same, It's the same Islamic sciences, the same paradigm, but it's just upside down, text. So when you have the text in the bottom, you know what do you have here? Desire, political agenda, isn't it? Hating and liking and disliking. So you start letting the text justify what you have, right? So the text becomes a justifier. While in the other way, you try to make sense of the text. But here, you try to make sense of what you want by using the text, right? That's the main difference. So that's an important thing to talk about before we get into what we will be studying today. There is one more thing, that when we write, Muslim scholars said to us, you can't just feel like writing something and you go ahead and write it. This is not a Twitter account. It's not Facebook. Every time you feel angry with something, or you feel happy about something, or you feel like doing something, you do it. We have a responsibility called the responsibility towards what we say. So, because we have a responsibility, then you have to fill in a gap in knowledge. If you're going to write an article or an essay or a book, there has to be a gap in knowledge that you want to fill, isn't it? That gap in knowledge could be a gap in the content or a gap in the form. A gap in the content, an area that hasn't been covered, isn't it? So gap, area not covered. Or another, so that's gap one. There is another gap. Details needed, right? Someone wrote, but he was so short, so you need details. There is another gap, gap 3. Too much details. Possibly in Islam, we don't only focus on understanding, but we focus on memorization as well. Or it might be, as we mentioned earlier today, it might be that the text is addressed to the elites. So you need to take it down. So there is gap 4. So area not covered. Basically, area not covered could be incomplete knowledge or no previous literature. So someone has not written on that topic at all. Or he wrote, but what happened? He didn't finish. There is something to add. And so that's 1. So that's 1 and 2. 3, 4, 5. Right. So number 5, if the person, for example, Rahmukumullah, mistake, wrong conclusion. Someone made a mistake. We can just leave it like that. So basically, you're challenging their conclusion. Number 6, it might be the case that the person did not construct the content in a right way. So we say that's to do with the form. If we reconstruct this, it will make a lot of sense. How often do you hear a subject and you don't understand it? Not because of what is said, but because of the way it was said. Right? So, or it could be, number 7, it could be to compile. If a topic is discussed at different places, in different books, and you can see a hidden link, right? You can see what? A hidden link. If I put these together, it will make a lot of sense. Here, the issue of what? It was wrongly structured. This is what? It was scattered. Sometimes you focus so much on collecting and putting together that, or on writing a specific issue, that you don't see. If you take a step back and you look and say, there is a link between this and this and this. Now when we read this book, you will see that there is actually, what we will be reading is the binary relationships between topics. What links the topics together? How many subjects, how many purposes do we have? 7, isn't it? They call these al-asbab al-sab'a lit-ta'lif, the 7 reasons why 2 people should write. You should write either to complete something that's incomplete, or to invent something in a topic where there is no previous literature. You should write because there is more details needed. We call this, we call this ikmal, right? Ikmal, to complete. And then we call this ikhtira'. You know what ikhtira' is? To invent. And then we call this sharh. And we call this ikhtisar, to sum up. And then we call this islah. You know what islah is? To fix a mistake. And we call this tartib, to order something that is not well ordered. And we call this jam', to combine. If anyone writes outside these 7, then he is misusing his or her time. Right? Now, ul-Tafseer, or all the ulum that we talk about, whether it is grammar or it is morphology or anything other than these 2, these sciences, the ulama have said, let me tell you about the area that needs work in each of these. So that if you want to focus, you should focus when there is a big gap. So they said we can divide the ulum into 3 categories. Ulum that need no more work, Basically, you can't write any more about that. And there are ulum that need a little bit more work. And there are ulum that need too much work. They put that in Arabic and they said, Al-ulumu ilmun nadaja wa ihtaraq. You know when you leave food on the cooker, what will happen to it? Burn, isn't it? So they said there are ulum that have been cooked, overcooked and burnt. Meaning, you can't cook it anymore. That's it. Like tajweed. What would people write on tajweed? We exhausted all the topics of tajweed. You might say, okay, but can I present tajweed in a multimedia way? Yes, you can, but that's not writing on tajweed. You can't write a new topic. There's no new topics in tajweed to write about. But there are other ulum that have been cooked, but it will be better if you leave it to simmer a little bit. Then when we eat it, it will be well cooked. That needs a bit of work. Like, they said like fiqh. Fiqh, the rules of fiqh, I mean by the rules, the methods of extracting fiqh are established. There is no more work in that. But what you can do is every time someone asks me a new question, I can go back to these rules and apply them. So there is an area of work. Then there is a third area where it hasn't even cooked. It hasn't even reached the level of cooking. Where is that? Tafseer. That ilm. That ilm that stands on the pinnacle of Islamic sciences. Why? Because the Quran is an open-ended text. What do you mean by an open-ended text? There is no end for it. If you say something, I understand it in one way, second way, third way, but that's it. It's not open for interpretation unlimitedly, but the Quran is open for interpretation unlimitedly, as long as the person has taken the roots that would lead him to do so. Otherwise, it will be open for interpretation unlimitedly, but you might deviate from what the purpose of the text is. Is that clear? With that in mind, let's read this book. Who's going to read? Who is willing to read? Who has the book? Yes. So we'll read from the translator's introduction. By the way, this book, as you will see in the translator's introduction, is an introduction to a tafsir book. This tafsir, they published only this volume of it. So he will mention in the introduction. This is the volume of tafsir that they talk about. It's called An-Nibras by Shaykh Ali Jum'ah, who was the former Grand Mufti of Egypt. He was one of my teachers. So the introduction to the tafsir is the book that you have in your hand. And this is the book that you have in your hand. It's these 85 pages. Right? So we will read, and along our reading, we will be talking about what is being said here. Bismillah. From the translator's introduction.
The art of Quranic commentary or exegesis is one of the most essential frontiers of Islamic knowledge, because the Quran is the primary source of knowledge for all Muslims.
So that's the importance of tafsir. Why is tafsir so important? Why do we have to bother about it? Because Quran is the source of knowledge. What do you mean by it's a source of knowledge? That the Quran has something called worldview. The Quran has a worldview. And this worldview informs all our choices. It informs our morality. It informs what we are supposed to do and what we're not supposed to do. So the Quran is not just a reduced text that we recite when we need some healing, or that we recite when someone passes away, or that we recite when we need to understand what happened in the Battle of Badr. No, the Quran is a text that formulates Islamic knowledge. It's the primary source of Islamic knowledge. Why is it the primary source of Islamic knowledge? Because it tells us what our Creator wants from us. Isn't it? So it carries the message that our Creator wants to deliver to us. So I would like to know, what shall I do in case I see that the society is turning against me? I go back in general. Therefore, you can't diffuse it with little things. Go on.
The process of understanding the Quran comprises two components. The
Mm.
first is more or less static, involving, as it were, immutable truth, while,
Yes.
while the second is dynamic, involving the application of Quranic knowledge to deal with ever-changing social and historical situations.
We can then say, or we can highlight in that text, that we have two things to deal with: Quranic variables and Quranic static truths. Where would Muslims fail? When people try to deal with variables as static and deal with static as variables. So many Muslims today would take a static truth in the Quran and then they will say, no, this is a changing thing. And they will take something that is changing and they will say, this is static. By the way, you might not find the second group, but you will definitely find the first group. Those who try to make the whole Quran turn into variables, right? So when the Quran says, for example, hijab, hijab as a cover is a static, but the form of it is variable. The Quran says, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. So, khimar, which means to cover the head, is static. That's clear. But what color should it be? The way it should be, how you should tie it, that's a variable. That's left to the urf of the people, right? So there is an area of variable and there is an area of what? Of static. So some people try to play with the static truths. So they try to play around with it. Mm-hmm.
As well as new scientific discoveries, there is thus a process that needs to keep up with changing circumstances by constant renewal.
So that is very, very, very important. Because if we understand that the language of the Quran has variables, or the Quran has variable and immutable truths, and our duty towards the variables is that we need to understand them in the context of the centuries that we live in, that means if someone does not understand what is going on around, they have no right to talk about the Quran. He will actually mention much later that one of the tools of tafsir is to know what is going around in the world. The mufassir is not just a Mawlana who has studied Arabic language, but he is someone who is very well versed in the challenges facing our time. Which means that a mufassir is an encyclopedic scholar who knows philosophy, who knows science, who knows a bit of physics and chemistry and so on and so forth. It's not just, in other words, tafsir is not the job of a graduate of a religious school. It's the job of encyclopedic scholars who have gone way beyond that.
Therefore, to be able to complete their work successfully, the commentators or exegetes of every age are required to arm themselves with every resource available in their time.
Yes. And since no one can encompass all the knowledge available at the time, the tafsir attempt will always be limited to the knowledge of the person. And he will say, and that's why he will mention later on that one of the mistakes Muslims fall into is try to interpret the Quran in light of scientific discoveries. Scientific discoveries are variable. They are changing much faster even than the Quranic variables. So when we try to interpret the Quran in that, and we say, hold on a second, look, the Quran is truthful. How? It's in agreement with scientific discoveries. Remember that these discoveries have not come out of the lab yet. So they are still subject to investigation, criticism, and so on and so forth. When you subject the Quran to these scientific discoveries, and later on they make a conclusion that this is not valid anymore, you are directly invalidating your own book. Don't make the Quran dependent on scientific discoveries. The truthfulness of the Quran is independent from any discovery. The Quran is not a book of science. Mm-hmm.
The resources necessary for our time are evidently different from those required in previous centuries. If they are to be used, these resources need to be first identified and delineated.
Not only that the resources that we have today are different from the previous centuries, but also because these resources are different, the challenges are different, therefore the tafsir and the structure and the construction of tafsir is different. One of the things that I have found very interesting is I was looking at how academicians specialize in tafsir. And many Muslims, Muslim and non-Muslim academicians, they work on tafsir al-Quran. But their work on tafsir al-Quran is mainly a translation of a previous tafsir. How many translations of the Quran have been produced over the last century? Many, right? There's so many. I can count at least 20. Or at least. I have in my own library more than 25 translations of the Quran. Pickthall, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, Arthur James Arbery, Ahmed Zaki Hamad, Muhammad Abdul Halim, and then you have Aisha Bewley, it's like one of the most recent ones. Muhammad Asad, Message of the Quran. Loads. There is like loads of them. One of my friends in Canada, Dr. Mustafa Khattab, had something, I think it's called the Clear Quran. Yeah, the Clear Quran. It's like at least 10 or 15 we can count. But how many tafsirs were written in English about the Quran? Nothing. But how many academic works have discussed the tafsir of the Quran? Many. So what is happening is we have shifted our attention from making the Quran relevant to making the interpretation of previous scholars relevant. So you read, for example, in Al-Fakhr al-Razi, one of the tafsir. Al-Fakhr al-Razi is understanding how the movement of the sun is. He understands that within the parameters of science that was available at his time, medieval time. That might make us laugh when we read what he said, but that was very reasonable at his time. You know, when you read some books of medicine, traditional medicine, medieval traditional medicine, and they tell you, if you eat this or you have this, that will stop your diarrhea and this will give you diarrhea. And you're like, you laugh, isn't it? But that's laughable now. It was not laughable then. Because for them, as human beings, this is the maximum they could have achieved. They made that association because this is what was meaningful to them. So today, what we happen to do is we are trying to make sense of medieval knowledge, the variables of medieval knowledge in the context of a modern world. What we should do is to make sense of the static, transcendent knowledge, but with the variables of our time. Possibly write a new tafsir of the Quran. A well-established scholar writes a tafsir of the Quran. Go on.
This is what brought the author of this book to act as a suggestion to the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, Shaykh Ali Jum'ah, to compile in a single work the gist of everything that has been said by previous scholars, and then added to the novel ideas which are in the process of being formulated by contemporary scholars, including Shaykh Ali himself and the author.
So what Sheikh Osama did, because I actually got this book from Sheikh Osama when it was firstly published in 2009. And he actually related to me the story of how he came up with this book. So one of the areas that are not covered well is Usul al-Tafseer. Yes, we have loads of books of tafsir out there, but we don't have enough to tell us what is the methodology of writing up a tafsir. What are the instructions? What is the manual? Of course, there is no strict manual, but what are the areas that I should be aware of? What are the steps? What are the themes that I should, what is the manifesto of tafsir that I should follow? You will find that there is unfortunately very limited number of books that talk about it. There's Usul al-Tafseer by Ibn Taymiyyah. There is another book on Usul al-Tafseer by Shah Wali Allah al-Dahlawi. That's possibly the most common one. And then what happens is we have some scattered knowledge. In Al-Itqan, it tells you very, very briefly, Al-Itqan of Imam Suyuti, that a mufassir should have these tools, these qualifications, and that's it. In some introductions of tafsir books, like Tahir bin Ashur, Tahrir wa Tanwir, in the introduction, he mentions to us his methodology. So you can extract the methodology of Tahir bin Ashur. Now, when we look at the tafsir of Tahir bin Ashur, after he has written it, is this tafsir acceptable by the ummah? It is. It's a respected tafsir, which means that the effort of Tahir ibn Ashur in writing a tafsir is successful. So when an experience or an experiment is successful, I should go and look at the mechanism that was applied in that experiment and take it, because it has produced a successful experience. When someone makes it to the top in his GCSE, they will go and ask him, what are the mechanisms of studying that you used? Is it? So we normally ask successful people about the mechanism they have used. So when we read the introduction of Tahir ibn Ashur, he might hint at, oh, I did this and I did this and I did this, and the mufassir should be doing this and should be doing that. Okay, this is his mechanism. Let me extract that. But that's one single, and because it produced a valid and an acceptable tafsir. I might go to somebody else, and somebody else, and somebody else, and somebody else, and then compile all of these. That's now collective effort of successful people, and say, this is what, and we hear that quite a lot. What do successful people, like the 7 habits of highly influential people, the 7 habits of highly successful people, the 7 habits of the this and that. So when we look at the 7 principles of a highly effective tafsir, that's what Usul ul-Tafseer is. It's principles of how can tafsir be a successful one. Go on, Sidi.
A compact text of this kind addressed primarily to professional scholars and prospective activities.
Yeah.
Which is why on first reading I found it difficult. Nevertheless, struck by how vitally important the topic was, I suggested that the book be translated to English while declining to do it myself, my excuse being a chronic lack of time. However, many months later, at the insistence of the author, Shaykh, I finally agreed to undertake the translation, but on the condition that he gave us a series of 4 lectures on the book, which he graciously did.
Yes. So in fact, yeah, continue till the end of this paragraph.
The session provides proved richly productive. We asked many questions and digressed into many related and unrelated topics. Any word or passage I found obscure or ambiguous was inquired about and clarified. Translation being a kind of interpretation. The liberties I felt obliged to take with text to make it more accessible to the English reader were repeatedly discussed, which the author and his approval obtained. I hope that following his explanatory efforts, the English text will be sufficiently clear and require no more than the brief note I have added here and there.
So this is very important, because it actually gives insight on how can a good translation come about. Translation is a form of interpretation, isn't it? You are trying to say what somebody else has written in a different language. So you have to be very well versed in the language that you're translated into, how language is communicated, how meanings are communicated. And secondly, you need to make sure that your understanding of the source language is correct. Surprisingly, I have found that some translators, very, very well-versed translators, make very silly mistakes in their translation, even though that should not put down the value of their translation. But that comes from the fact that they did not understand the word. What they needed was simply to delve into the depths of the understanding of this word. It makes no excuse for someone who is translating a text written by a living individual, a living author, to translate the text without meeting the author and sitting with the author and asking that author, what did you want to say here? They say the best commentary written on a text is what is written by the author of the text. Earlier today we studied As-Sanusiyyah by the commentary of who? As-Sanusi himself. He knows what he wants to say. We study in Aqidah al-Kharida of Ahmed al-Dardir rahimahullah. And who is the commentator? Al-Dardir himself. So whenever you find a text that has been explained by the author, he is the best one. He is the most authoritative. His name is author, right? And authoritative comes from that. So he is the most authoritative individual to tell you what was running in his mind. If you have the chance to read to that person what he said and understand it, because he doesn't understand the language you want to translate into, fine, that's the best thing to do. If you can't, then you read it to someone who possibly was attending when that was explained. You know, brothers and sisters, you might be surprised. This is how they used to verify the nusakh, the manuscripts of books. So they say the best manuscript of a book is one that was read on the author. In other words, if I want to pick up a copy of Sahih Muslim, for example, there is loads of prints out there, isn't there? And everyone who is reprinting Sahih Muslim, they will have to mention, why should I buy their print and not another print? They might have a very nicely printed one, but it's in terms of like aesthetics, the beauty of it, it's amazing, but in terms of correctness, it's not great. Why should I buy another copy that's less beautiful unless it is more correct? How do we know that the one is more correct? You know, you say, this has been taken or corrected or verified by referring to an original manuscript, which was read to the author. As soon as they say, this is a reprint of a manuscript that was read to the author, if they even say, وَعَلَيْهَا خَطُّ, his writing is on it. For example, it was read to Malik, the Muwatta was read to Malik, and then Malik signed on it. I give ijazah. That means this was corrected from Malik himself. If not, then something that was read to his student. Why? He's closer. This is a way of verifying texts. If this is a way of verifying texts, and this is what gives weight, because a lot of brothers and sisters, when they buy books, they just buy without knowing. Okay, I found this nice print. What do you mean by nice print? What do you mean by nice print? Do you mean correct? Or do you mean it's nicely presented with a nice cover and multicolored? Right, so if we have a book and we want to present it correctly, we need to make sure that I move beyond the form to understand what is the purport. What does the author purpose to say? And this is what Dr. Mustafa al-Badawi did. He read this book to Shaykh Usama and he discussed it with him. Even in my translation of An-Nubdha al-Sughra by Shaykh al-Habib Abu Bakr Mashhur, I read the book with him and discussed. So what do you mean by this? Possibly there is ambiguity. Now,
the author, a teacher of Islamic sciences at the University in Cairo, is in possession of a sound grasp of the traditional scholarly sciences, as well as being fully conversant with the cultural, sociological, and historical conditions of the time.
yeah.
Notwithstanding the above statement that the work is aimed at professional scholars, there is a lot of precious information to be gained from reading it.
Yeah.
It is especially true for those who, while not professional scholars, nevertheless wish to acquaint themselves with the difficulties and intricacies of the Quranic traditions, and thus be able to fully appreciate the various commentaries they have at hand.
Because we have a problem of liquidating and lowering the level of our scholarship. So he mentions two things here. One, that the author himself is well equipped to address this topic, a difficult topic. And secondly, that at the beginning, remember he said that this is mainly for scholars, professionals. So someone might just like put this pamphlet away and say, I don't need to know this. This is not for me. But he says, no. If something is not for you, because you will not understand it, it doesn't mean it's not for you that you will not benefit from it. You can benefit from something that you don't understand. How? By appreciating how difficult it is to do it, how difficult it is to carry, how dangerous it is. Sometimes you go to the court of law just to watch how verdicts are presented. Therefore, you learn, even if you don't understand law, you learn how to listen attentively to two litigants outside the court of law. You might be sitting in a tajweed class, not to learn tajweed, or you're not interested, but to see how difficult it is to learn tajweed. Therefore, you appreciate next time the imam makes mistakes in the qibla, that he is combining difficulty of pronouncing the Quran and difficulty in standing in front of people and difficulty in reading from memory. So that's like 3 difficulties. I remember one of the brothers used to correct and comment on an imam of a masjid once. So the imam said to him, next time you lead the salah. He said, no. He pulled out. He said, no, next time you lead the salah. If you'd like to know the difficulty of something, just try to see how is it happening. You know, we normally take the children to factories, like chocolate factory, that factory, this factory, to show them the hard work that is done. So when they pick up a piece of chocolate and they say, oh, you know what, I can just like eat this, remember that this is a product of a long process of work. A few years ago, someone told me of this journalist in New York who was kind of a secular Jew. And he is interested in trying things. So this journalist decided to live a year in accordance to the Bible, by the letter of the Bible. But he had a big dilemma. Which Bible will he live by? So he wanted to apply all the laws of the Bible, the legal side of the Bible, like stone an adulterer and like slaughter and do all sorts of things, and reproduce and have more children. So he decided in the end to compile a few Bibles and then highlighted all the laws that he came across, and he came up with something like 700 laws. So he decided to apply these laws throughout 1 year. So for 1 year, he will live by that. So one of the laws was to grow the sides of his hair. One of the laws is not to shave his beard. So by the end of the year, he had like a huge beard and dreadlocks on the side. And one of the laws, is to pray frequently, isn't it? This stands for reason. He has to pray. But of all the things that we can do, prayer is the most intro thing. It's like it's a very personal thing. In other words, you can do the form of prayer, but prayer will not be effective unless you live it. And this is secular guy. He doesn't believe in what he's doing. So yes, he can stone an adulterer outwardly. He can grow his beard outwardly, as many Muslims do. But feeling into prayer and feeling into dhikr, remembrance of Allah, is very difficult. So he said, I had to create a meaning for myself to pray for. And he made this acronym, I can't remember it. But basically, he said, I am going to pray in appreciation of others. In appreciation of others. Because he doesn't have a purpose. He doesn't believe in God. In reality, he was not a believer. He said, I'm going to pray in appreciation of others. How? He said, I will choose every day a blessing that I have and start appreciating the people who are behind that. So he said, one day, I am going to pray in appreciation of the apples that I bought from the supermarket. The ones who washed these apples, and the ones who packed these apples, and the ones who transported these apples, and the farmer who grew up these apples. And he said, you know what, after a while, I developed a sense of appreciation for the little things that I would have taken for granted. He calls that dissonance. You know what dissonance is? Dissonance is when you do something artificially for a long time until it becomes a second nature to you. And this is what we practice in dhikr. If you start doing dhikr every day, it's very difficult at the beginning. After 40, 50 days, 2 months, it becomes easy. What has happened is it has infiltrated your system already, and it has become part of your life. That's what we call dissonance. So this person started to what? To appreciate. So when you attend gatherings, or when you see, or when you read a book, and oh, you know what, this is very difficult, or when you sit in a place and you see something happening and you watch it, you will appreciate the mechanism and the difficulty and the effort that is being put into that. So if we want to teach our children how should they appreciate, we normally take them to the background work. Oh, look, there is a background work. You see the streets clean, but you don't know how tough it is to make it clean. So he says here that it is very important for people to acquaint themselves with the difficulties and intricacies of Quranic exegesis, and thus be able to fully appreciate the various commentaries they have at hand. So you'll be able to appreciate the tafasir by looking at the mechanism of making a mufassir, the mechanism of making a scholar of fiqh. You need to look at how long does it take. Because sometimes people really laugh at scholarship. Oh, you just need to memorize Quran. But that's a task in itself. You just need to learn Arabic. Yeah, that's a big task in itself. Right? Go on, Sidi.
Some of the subjects mentioned by the author have already been discussed by previous writers.
Yeah. So he is not inventing. Actually, in this book, he has fulfilled the 7 reasons for writing. Yeah. Go on.
Others seem to be new additions demanded by the conditions of our time. These will require in-depth exploration by contemporary and future scholars.
So there is always, brothers and sisters, there is always new components to be added to the mechanism. When they produce a new car, they would always look at what failures were witnessed in the previous car and the conditions that require this car to be used for. If you go to Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, for example, you will realize that they have these metal studs in their tires because of snow, so they don't want their cars to skid. Right? It's the same cars. If they produce cars for the UK, they will put the steering wheel on a different side of the car because they are produced to a condition of. So there is conditioning of things. You might add a new feature. So we might need at this time, for example, a new theme or principle for tafsir, like do not subject Quran to scientific discoveries. That might be a precaution that no one would have ever talked about before. There was no need. No, they were not doing it, or it was done, but it didn't drive people away from faith. Why? Because science was not as influential in deciding how the society perceives knowledge. But nowadays, science is very important. Science tells people what to believe in and what not to believe in. Science is the parameter for judging sacred texts, right? Because of that, we need to say, by the way, the sacred and the scientific, one of them is absolute, the other is not absolute. So please do not judge the absolute within the parameters of the non-absolute. Go on, Zidi.
The book is composed of 13 chapters, each concerned with one of the principles of exegesis as conceived by the author. Principle 1 and 2 serve together with the first.
Yes, let me explain this to you, or you read it first. Read it first, and then we. Mm-hmm.
Principles 3 and 4 are concomitant. They state that the primary meaning of
So preface and principle 1 and 2, they are what? They are introduction. We can call them principles, like notions. So the preface and principle 1 and principle 2 will give us the principles that we can move on from. Mm-hmm.
They state that the primary meaning of understanding the Quran is the Quran itself, followed by the Prophet's Sunnah. This indeed is the basic procedure that exegesis always follows. To to understand any particular topic in the Quran, then we start by compiling the verses connected with it and comparing them with each other. Then connecting the relevant prophetic traditions or hadith, and then compiling the comments of the companions, especially those of Ibn Abbas, then those of the followers, and finally those of subsequent scholars and men of God if needed.
So the second area, or principle 3 and 4, this is basically like a map of the book. He's now drawing a map of the book. So first, we have what we call principles. Second, we have the scope. If I have a task of dealing with the Quran, where is my source material? The Quran is not good. The Mufassir is not to be given all the source material that he needs. Because remember, there are static source material and there is variable source material. Static source material is the Quran itself. In fact, this map is very academic, because the first thing you look at is, if I am going to do a research, what literature has been written on this subject. So you can't build on something. You can't invent something unless you build on the previous literature. So what's the previous literature? Okay, the first literature is the Quran itself. The Quran carries texts that are mujma' and mufassal. There are texts that are ambivalent, that are summed up, and there are texts that are more detailed. So if I would like to understand the Quran, I have to understand the Quran by the lens of the Quran itself. We mentioned earlier that the best commentator on a book is who? Is the author. The author himself, isn't it? The best commentary to read on a text is the one that is written by the author. But there is no commentary on the Quran because the Quran is text, but some parts of the Quran are commented on some other parts. A good example of that is wherever we find Ism al-Mawsul, this particle. سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى. A'la means high, isn't it? Most high. But there is a difference, notions of ulu. There is ulu in makan, space, isn't it? So when you say ana a'la, we are in the second floor, we are higher than the ground floor. The first floor higher than ground floor. But there is also ulu in makana, station, position. When you say the manager is higher than the employee, that's not a physically, it's in position. Or when you say, for example, هذا أعلى من ذاك, this is more higher than that in quality, right? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says سبح اسم ربك الأعلى, and I want to understand this, I need to understand it within the terms of the Quran itself. What does the Quran tell us about it? Right after الذي خلق فسوى قدر فهدى أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء. Look at these ayat that follow. خلق فسوى. It's not just he created, but he created in proportion. People create, but they are not proportionate in everything. So that khalq is higher than any other khalq because of the proportion that is embedded in it. الذي قدر فهدى. That when he placed talents and abilities and capabilities, he guided human beings and animals and things to use and utilize that. You might embed someone or embed something. You might put something, but you don't know how the use of it. And so on and so forth. So when we understand a'la, we have to understand it from within the parameters of the Quran. When we understand, if there is nothing in the Quran, then we go to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because he is the one who communicated it, and so on and so forth. So 3 and 4 highlight to us the scope of research and the literature that we should consult before we go ahead and do our tafsir. Naam, go on.
This is generally accompanied by linguistic analysis of key terms. How much of this material is actually quoted any particular commentary depends on the intended length of the word.
Yes.
Some commentaries being detailed and comprehensive, others quite brief. The length of the text and the creed and philosophical orientation of the exegete will dictate what other avenues of exploration will pursue. For instance, historical information from Muslim sources, and stories of previous communities from Jewish sources.
So this is very, very important as well, because it doesn't only tell us the scope of where we should be looking, but it also tells us that by looking at the scope, we can tell the nature of the author. How is that? If a mufassir is a mu'tazili, he will always utilize language to prove and to support his mu'tazilite choices, his theological choices. As Zamakhshari, all the way through his tafsir, he will always use language to prove his own choices of theology. If the mufassir is a muhaddith or a scholar of hadith, he will not give much attention to philosophical discussions. It will only be pretty much textual. We expect a textual tafsir. If you look at a tafsir that the author of is a linguist, his focus will be on showing the linguistic excellence. In fact, by looking at these features of tafsir, the ulama ended up with categories of tafsir. So they said this is a linguistic tafsir. If the author is faqih, is a jurist, what will be his focus? Fiqh. So his focus will be how can everyone makes their choices in life. Our choices are normally based on who we are and what level of knowledge do we have. When you look at someone's dress, the way they dress and the way they choose the way they conduct their life, you can say, oh, they have a taste. How did you know that they have a taste? You have seen their choices, right? Taste is something intangible. The Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda says, اختيار المرء قطعة من عقله. What you choose is part of your mind. When you select, that reflects what type of mind do you have. So when someone goes for very excellent English written texts and suggests you to read that, you will say, well, this is very difficult for me. So his standard of excellence is very high, right? So اختيار المرء قطعة من عقله. I'll give you an example of this. Oxford and Cambridge normally choose the very good students, isn't it? Why? How do we know that they choose the very good students? Because of their standards of selection, right? So their ikhtiyar, their selection, is an indication of what mentality runs these two schools. And what minds are they looking for? And what are they aiming to produce? Whether this has declined or hasn't declined, that's a different issue. But it's still the standard of selection that tells you what type of person is this. When you see someone going to the shops and he only chooses like cheap stuff, you will say, that person is cheap. How did you make that conclusion? Because you have looked at what they're after. If you see someone choosing the easy solution in every madhab, you will say that person is not right. Why do you make that conclusion? Because that individual you observe the selection. Based on the selection, you make that conclusion. So when we read a book of tafsir, we can easily say, oh, this is a mufassir. This mufassir is a linguist. No, this mufassir is a jurist. No, this mufassir is an usuli. This mufassir is a theologian. All his discussions are about the philosophical challenges, the discourse of the Quran. If you find a person highlighting the scientific this and the scientific that, oh, this must be a physicist, or he must be a biologist, or he must be a scientist, and he just wants to kind of give that flavor of tafsir, right? So the tafasir tells you the creedal and the philosophical, the theological affiliation of the mufassir. And it tells you also the specification, the specialty of that mufassir. What type of mufassir should we, right? Go on, Sidi.
Principal and which involve inferences understood independently from the context have also been agreed upon since first exegesis.
Yes, there is, as much as we said that the Quran has variables, do you remember that? So that the Quran has variables, but there is also has absolute truths, static truths, like it will never change throughout time, that there is personal accountability for one's sins and guilt. The Quran says, أَلَّا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. You can't say about this ayah, أَلَّا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, that no one is responsible for the sins of somebody else. You can't say, well, this is relevant to a specific context. Nowadays, we live in a different cultural context, so I can punish children for the mistakes of their parents, or parents for the mistakes of their children. No, that is a principle that stands by itself throughout time, regardless of the historical context. These are called al-mabadi' al-Qur'aniyya al-amma. Al-mabadi' al-Qur'aniyya al-amma, these general Quranic principles.
Principle 6, which states that the exegete must be familiar with the latest that the civilization of his time has produced in terms of knowledge, has also always been known. Witness, for instance, the monumental commentary of Razi, where he makes use of practically every science known to mankind in his day.
So this principle talks about the capacity of the mufassir. So capacity of the mufassir, like how knowledgeable should the mufassir be in order to carry out this process of tafsir. The mufassirun of the past used to delay writing a tafsir till the very late stages of their life. Has anyone heard of a tafsir written by An-Nawawi? No. Even though An-Nawawi is encyclopedic, but he died at the age of 45. Did you ever think, why did An-Nawawi write amongst all his books a tafsir? He possibly thought he's young for this. Is there any tafsir of Al-Hafiz Jalaluddin al-Suyuti? Yes. Very small tafsir, Tafsir al-Jalalain, right? But how old was al-Suyuti when he passed away? Much older than An-Nawawi. There are scholars who outlived al-Suyuti and who outlived An-Nawawi, and yet they didn't write tafsir. As I said, if tafsir is in the pinnacle of Islamic sciences, it is also in the pinnacle of the intellectual maturity of the scholar. They don't write at a young age. Why? They wait until they think, I am now possibly in a position of claiming that I have a wide knowledge of what is surrounding me. My life experience has matured enough that I can turn to the Book of Allah and start explaining. So the person has to have the tools of encompassing the knowledge that was available at his or her time in order to be able to practically carry out tafsir. So this question, number 6, principle number 6, is about the capacity of the mufassir and the scope of his or her knowledge.
However, this principle needs to be stressed in our age where the expansion of knowledge is explosive and the use of new data needs to be strictly regulated according to explicit criteria which restrict the exegete to the incontrovertible scientific facts of the age in order to avoid the state of experimentation.
Yeah.
Similarly, principles 12 and 13, which are those of Quranic purposes and the science of derivatives, have been known since the old days, or need to be given to attention and used in a more systematic manner. We have listed those content of them.
So this, the principle 12 and 13, they deal with the tools of the mufassir. So the mufassir needs to have knowledge of the Quranic purposes. There is something very interesting here. As much as a faqih is supposed to apply the rules of law to the case at hand, he should do so with the purpose of the law in mind. Again, as much as a faqih is supposed to apply the rules of law to the case at hand, as much as a judge is supposed to apply the rules of law to the case at hand, he should do so in spirit of the law, not in contradiction to the spirit of law. So for example, the law says that whoever commits X crime is to be imprisoned that amount of years. So while the judge and the law says it is by the discretion of the judge to reduce this. That word of discretion is big. So while the judge is applying that rule, that if this person, and he sees in front of him a person who has committed a crime and he needs to be imprisoned for X amount of years, but he sees that this is the first time this person has committed that crime. And he's a young man. If I imprison him for that amount of years, I destroy his future. He might choose to apply in the spirit of law the punishment, but reduce the punishment to the minimum available. Why? Because he wants to make sure that he does not violate the purposes. So the purposes of the Quran, as we will see much later, one of the purposes of the Quran is hidayah, is to guide. Within this purpose, we understand why would the Quran punish certain people and speak harshly to them. It is harshness with the purpose of guiding, not harshness as a purpose of harshness. When we understand harshness without the purpose of the Quran, we just adopt harshness as an aim rather than a tool. Right? So when a father or a mother are turning harsh on their children, they do so to discipline them. If that spirit of discipline disappears, then harshness will be standing alone. And that will turn into what? It will not be harshness anymore. It will be tyranny. It will be torture. It will be violence. You name it. Because the purpose is what? Is revenge. While if you put discipline on top, that will not be revenge. You reduce the punishment. You'll give that, you understand that that punishment is a form of medication, and you don't give medication at big amounts. You give it at small amounts, small dosages. It's gone. It's gone. Mm-hmm.
Principles 8, 9, and 11 are entirely novel approaches to understanding the Quran. The stories of the prophets are here considered as
prototypal
expositions of the various manners in which humanity has responded in the past to essential issues such as the existence of God, revelation, right and wrong, and the relation between religion and life in general and politics in particular.
This is so important because a whole big chunk of the Quranic ayat relate to the stories of prophets. And when we normally read the stories of prophets, we think, this is a form of amusement. But have you ever asked yourself, why out of so many prophets that we are not told about, the Quran only selects 25? And we have them by name. And why out of 25, we are told only about a small number in the Quran? And out of those, there is a big discrepancy between the amount of knowledge and story in each. Musa alayhi salam, huge story. Like imagine if you make a diagram or a graph of the stories of prophets in terms of percentage. Who will get the highest percentage? Musa. But what about Dhul Kifl? What about Al-Yasa'? What about Ilyas? Lut? Yes. Shu'aib? Yes. But what about Luqman? What about Sulaiman? What about Isa alayhi salam? What has happened to Isa from birth until he came with his message? And what has happened to Isa after that? How was the life of Maryam after Isa alayhi salam delivered his message? After she has that encounter with her people and saying to them, look at my son, speak to him, he is a baby in the cradle. What has happened to her? She must have had a life. The Quran is completely silent. What happened to the people of the cave? How did the people of the cave grow up? How many of them were there? Who is Pharaoh? Was he Ramses or somebody else? All of these details are not mentioned in the Quran. one of the funny things is when a student asks his teacher, what was the gender of the whale that swallowed Yunus alayhi salam? It's unnecessary detail. So the Quranic stories that do exist in the Quran are meticulously selected, and the proportion that is given to each one of them has a lot to do with who we are. Musa alayhi salam is the closest to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His experience as a prophet is the closest to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, a lot of people don't understand this hadith. They say, the hadith goes, لو كان موسى حيا لما وسعه إلا أن يتبعني. If Moses was alive, he wouldn't have done anything more than to follow me. People think that he would follow the Prophet ﷺ only by being one of his ummah. Yes, this is supported by other ahadith. But possibly, I had a thought, possibly, that it could have meant he would have followed my method of growing up a community, because Musa had big challenges facing. He faced many challenges growing up Banu Israel, isn't it? Loads of challenges. Takes them out of Egypt, and as soon as they arrive somewhere, they tell him, we want you to create a god for us, like to give us an idol. He goes away, and how often did the Prophet ﷺ leave Medina? And he came back, and the Sahaba had clarity of vision. They knew where they are stepping into. Right? So basically, possibly the Prophet ﷺ, Wallahu a'lam, possibly the Prophet ﷺ is saying that if Musa alayhi salam was alive, he would have followed if he was to see me, he would have to follow my method of growing up a community. He would have learned from me. Right? Ittaba'ani here is he would have learned from me, so that he would have been able to tame Banu Israel. But the Prophet ﷺ later on in another hadith, we should understand these two hadiths in light of each other. He says, Rahimallahu akhi Musa. Like, how may Allah have mercy on my brother Moses. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ realized that the community in Medina was different from Banu Israel. Banu Israel were very, very difficult to deal with. So Musa alayhi salam found a very difficult community. Right? So principle number 8, 9, and 11 are relating to the methodology, the universals. Read the universals. When the Quran selects certain stories, as we will see, it is actually telling us the qualities of communities and individuals, and the challenges that we as a Muslim community will face. The story of Musa alayhi salam has a few challenges. One of those challenges is political tyranny, right? Political tyranny. Musa alayhi salam faced Fir'aun. Who can relate to political tyranny in our community? There is so much in the Muslim Ummah today. So how do we carry out political change? Is it by confrontation or by saving our communities? Is it revival or survival? What is the way forward for the Ummah? Is it to revive the past or survive in the present? It's a question. So looking at the story of Musa might make sense of that. Lut alayhi salam facing a moral decay in his community. That's one of the big issues that are faced in the society today. Prophet Lut is more relevant to us today than it would have been related to people before. As Shaykh Hamza says very, very, very rightly, that same-sex relationship has always existed in human history. Right? It has always existed. But it was never promoted as an official or as a valid communal acceptable thing. You know what I mean? As a valid formula of union. It was never promoted. So it's the institutional. We have something called the institution of marriage, isn't it? The institution of marriage. So the institutionalization of that is what. And the first people who tried to institutionalize that and make it an widely accepted practice were the people of Lut. So the Quran objection is not just highlighting how that this form is wrong, or that this action is wrong, but the institutionalization of it is taking it at a completely different level. And this is why Prophet Lut alayhi salam is very relevant to us. That how did he deal with a situation like that? Prophet Sulaiman is relevant to Isa alayhi salam. Shu'aib. One of the things that we read is that Shu'aib alayhi salam, his people said to him, أصلاتك تأمرك أن نترك ما يعبد آباؤنا أو أن نفعل في أموالنا ما نشاء. At the beginning they objected to Shu'aib alayhi salam's message. And then later on when he insisted, they said to him, we're confused about you. You tell us to pray and to adopt this religion of oneness. But at the same time you say you have to be honest in business and never to cheat. What are you actually promoting? Worship of God or honesty in business? Those people were secular. They saw religion and business as two separate things. We live at an age today, you will relate to, this is the word that they use today, humanization. What's humanization? Humanizing morality. As Muslims, we have something called divinizing morality, meaning morality is morality because it's divine. It's not dictated by me or you. If I dictate it or you dictate it, then it becomes variable. So what is acceptable today might not be acceptable. It's humanized. So we humanize charity. We humanize respecting the elders. We humanize honesty. We humanize this. We humanize that. No, it's not. What is good because God has said it is good. There's an article that I just printed yesterday. I haven't had the chance to look at it. It's by Robert George. Robert George is a professor of law in America. He says it's on the Zaytuna College website and it's published in their journal, Renovatio. It says, does God and reason lead us to the same good? Does God and reason lead us to the same good? In other words, will revelation and my own reasoning lead me to the same, to say the same thing about the same thing? Like to say that what is good is what is good? You know, that goes back to what? That goes back to a rational discussion or a theological discussion called التحسين والتقبيح العقليين. Rational liking and disliking. In other words, when we say that something is good, what is the authority? Is it good? Is it good because our minds says it's good? Or is it good because Allah says it is good? The Mu'tazila have said Allah has gifted us with powers of intellect, therefore we can discern what is good and what is bad. Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah said no. What is good because Allah has made it good. Even if we don't see the beauty in it. And what is bad even if we don't see the ugliness in it. And that's a big debate. A big debate. What is the final authority? Is it the mind? Or is it God? And now, there is a beautiful exposition on that by Imam al-Ghazali. I think it's in Mustasfa. He says, if something is good by rationality, it should be good all the time. For example, killing, if it is good, if it's the aql that says it's good, it should be good all the time. But killing can be good at sometimes and can be bad at certain times. If you are executing a person who has killed 15 souls, that's not seen as a bad thing. But if you're killing an innocent individual, that's a bad thing. So how come the aql says it is good here and it's not good there, right? And if it is good, it should be good for all people. What is good, it should be good for all people and by all people. That all people of intellect should agree on something that is good. But nowadays, look at alcohol. If you ask anyone in the street, they will say, that's really good, isn't it? They will say it's a way of escaping our reality, right? And in the end of the week, we just switch off from that miserable world. But another person will say, but it makes you look like a clown. no respect. So is alcohol, is it getting intoxicated something good or something bad? What about cutting the tummy of someone and replacing their heart while they are not intoxicated, while they are not under anesthetic? Right? What about someone who's got some form of cancer and is going through pain and they get a specific medicine to reduce? All of these moral questions relate to what is good and what is bad. We think it's a very superficial discussion in aqaid. No, it's very deep. We face it in our day-to-day life. So when we look at the life of Shu'aib alayhi salam, that story, it carries a lot of universals, right? So that's number 13, number 8, 9, and 11. Go on. Naam, Sidi. Okay, we'll take a break then, inshallah. Barakallah. Inshallah, Sidi. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين ثم أما بعد. Continue, Sidi.
Humanity being what it is, we expect it to continue responding in the same manner in the future so that the teachings here remain as relevant today as they were 14 centuries ago.
So that's basically what he wants to say about the Quranic stories, that humanity is the same humanity, people, how far distant they could be in terms of time, but the same habits repeat themselves. Those who believed only in the sensual knowledge, Banu Israel, when they said to Musa alayhi salam, we won't believe you until we can see Allah face to face. These were people who believed only in their senses. That's something that will continue with people of today.
Next, the concept is suggested of the presence within each surah of an axis governing the variety of ideas discussed in it. Identifying and defining these axes would obviously allow a more strategic and thus coherent comprehension of the text. Finally, the laws can be identified that govern human societies and the rise and fall of civilizations, which would help to create a science of civilization based on revelation.
This is so important, brothers and sisters, because one of the principles that he talks about here relates to the word surah. Surah, taken from the word sur, wall, refers to something that is surrounded by a theme. So in 114 surahs of the Quran, we can identify 114 themes. Every surah has what we call thematic unity. There is a theme that governs this surah. It might discuss a lot of subtopics. For example, Surah Al-Baqarah is the biggest surah of the Quran, but there is an essential central theme that governs the whole surah. It goes right, left, and center, but you can look behind and then you see what brings all of these together. What's the unifying factor? So the concept is suggested of the presence within each surah of an axis governing the variety of ideas discussed in it. When you have a topic, when you are discussing a specific topic, there is a theme in your mind that you want to deliver. You might go right, left, and center, but the main theme is there. In The Art of Persuasion by Scott Crider, he talks of three ways of presenting your hujjah or your proof or your case. There is something called the legal appeal, and there is something called the moral appeal, and there is something called the rational appeal, or rational appeal, emotional appeal, and legal appeal. So rational appeal is when you talk to the minds of people. But not everyone gets affected by talking to their minds. Some people need some form of emotional charging to be moved. So you talk to their emotion. Some people might not be listening to this. Rationally, they might not listen. Emotionally, they might not listen. The only way that they will listen is to talk to them with using the legal, the instructions, the punishment, and the reward. So if someone is not convinced that theft is bad rationally, and they will not be moved by talking to their emotion about how bad impact their theft would leave on those whom they steal from, then the only way to go forward is to tell them what will happen to them should they steal, right? That they will be in big trouble. So this variation of appeals serve the same case, serve one case. The surah might have an essential theme. It does have an essential theme, but what serves this essential theme could be different topics, different subjects, different discussions. These discussions might seem to be a bit irrelevant, but in fact, there is a theme that combines, gathers all of them together. There is an axis governing each surah. Yeah.
The author presented the results of his efforts to Shaykh Ali Jum'ah. He was very pleased with it. The whole text was included before being published separately as an additional introduction to the first volume of the Studies on Quranic Commentary. All the notes are mine except for the references and notes it on page.
So, if I will have to keep these because I didn't put them together like this before. So if we want to draw a map for this book, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We can say that this book moves in this way. The preface and 1 and 2, principle 1 and 2, talk about principles. Then 3 and 4 talk about scope. 10 talks about universals. 6 talk about capacity. I mean by the capacity of the mufassir. 9, 8, and 11 talk about human experience or unifying factor. And then 12 and 13 talk about tools. He actually forgot 2 themes there to talk about, 2 principles. Did anyone spot that? 5 and 7. He didn't mention them. So 5 and 7, 5 and 7 talk about method. Talk about method. The principle 5 and principle 7, they talk about how the Quran uses different methods in achieving what it wants to achieve. How the Quran uses how the Quran, if we look later, inshallah, we'll see that number 5 and number 7, they talk about how the Quran uses different methods in achieving what it wants to achieve. Right. Now, we go to the preface and inshallah try to analyze it within the parameters of time. Sidi Bilal, how long do we have? Okay. Go on.
Praise belongs to God, Lord of all beings. May blessings and peace be upon our Master, the Messenger of God, the best of God's creation, and upon his family, companions, and all those who support and follow his guidance to the judgment day. To proceed. The Noble Quran is a divine book, a sacred text originated from God. It includes what is Sophic in the way of beliefs, legal rulings, good manners, organizational guidelines, and narratives.
So, here is a very important thing to start with, that the Quran is a divine book and a sacred text. We said before that people's perspective on the Quran decide the way they deal with the Quran. If you approach the Quran as a book, not as a sacred book, then you subjugate the Quran to all methods that you subjugate other books to. So critical studies, historical method. What's historical method? Historical method is when we deal with the Quran as a historical text. It talked about certain situation. We have people today who talk about the historicity of the Quran. You know what the historicity of the Quran is? Does anyone have a clue what is that? So ask me if you don't understand what I say. Ask me. I assume that you understand, but please don't nod. So what is historicity of the Quran? What do you mean by historicity? That something belongs to a specific historical period, isn't it? So the Bible, for example, belongs to a specific historical period, right? It was revealed or written. It was written in a specific historical time, right? A point in history. How is that relevant to its message? That we will ask, is the Bible then bound by the historical context in which it was written, i.e., does it have solutions for today's problems? If someone has written a book 1500 years ago, you know what, let me give you an example. Who knows the canon of Avicenna? Yes. The canon is a book of medicine written by Ibn Sina more than 500 years ago. It was, when it was translated to European languages, it was way advanced than what medicine and how medicine was practiced in Europe. So when it was introduced to European universities, everyone looked at it and said, wow, this is amazing. Now, after 500-600 years of the existence of canon, when modern medicine looks at that text, how does it look at it? Does it look at it as a reference or as a historic work? As a historic work. Yes, it was a great book at a certain period of time. So according to we can say the historicity of the canon means that, yes, it was a great book, but not anymore. No, not anymore. You can't take that and apply it anymore. So when we look at the Quran, some Muslims said the Quran, some Muslims say this today, they say the Quran is a great book, but it talks to us about أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ. Why don't they look at the camels, how they have been created? Isn't that what the Quran says? And so much, we live in the age of technology, nanotechnology and AI, isn't it? Artificial intelligence. Rather than talking to us about the camels and how they were created as a proof of the existence of God, this is a historical discourse that doesn't belong to today, isn't it? They might talk about, there was a TED talk I watched a while back of a Muslim lady in America who was talking about hijab and said, possibly some of you have come across it. She was saying, look, hijab was an amazing thing, but it was revealed in a context when people focused only on their lusts and desires. Now, who will be interested in seeing women's hair at the age of pornography? Right? This is how people will talk, isn't it? Now, there is no limits on what you can see. But in those societies that were very conservative societies, just seeing women's hair would make a person feel unbalanced. So the hijab came, cover and cover and cover. So it was relevant at one time in history, not anymore. That's the form of historical dealing with the Quran. You are looking at the themes of the Quran, and instead of saying, oh, these are in absolute, they are trans time and space, say, no, 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 they just apply to a specific historical context and not beyond that. Does that make sense to you? So, if we understand the Quran as a human book, then yes, a human book is decided by a human knowledge. And human knowledge is limited. I know what could be beneficial for Muslim students in British universities, but I don't know what is beneficial for Muslim students in Singaporean universities. Or I might be aware of what is beneficial for Muslim students today across the world, but not what will be beneficial for Muslim students in 200 years from now. Right? So when we say that the Quran is a divine book and it's a sacred text, we cannot just apply to it what we would apply to the historical human products. Human products are linked to history. In theological discussions, the Mu'tazila always raise the issue of that the word of God is created, isn't it? Have you heard about that? Has anyone heard about that? Right. We will not open that topic because it's a big topic. But anyway, when they say that the word of God is created, regardless of why do they say so, adopting that the word of God is created, adopting this view would lead to the historicity of the Quran, to say that the Quran is linked only to a specific historical context. But the Quran cannot be subjugated to historical methods because it's divine and because it is what? It is sacred. If you would like to subjugate something, if you would like to subjugate a book to the historical methods of testing it, then you do not have to believe in this book. You know what I mean? You have to deal with it as a human product and say, okay, let me now be very critical of it. Who is without bias? No one. Everyone has what? Has a bias. But we should only be aware of our bias. That's the most important thing. We should be aware of our bias. Now, when someone says that the Quran, when someone wants to subjugate the Quran to kind of historical research, there was a man in Egypt called Taha Hussein who wrote about pre-Islamic poetry. We spoke about pre-Islamic poetry earlier today. Pre-Islamic poetry. And following the Orientalist research in Paris, in Sorbonne University, he came up with an idea, a claim, that there was nothing called pre-Islamic poetry. It is all made up. It is what? All made up. It's all mythology. You know that word? Mythology? So there is mythology in old Greece. So he said, you know, all of these things that Arabs were talking about their past, it's all mythological. They just invented it and reproduced it. That was very dangerous. Why is that very dangerous? To say that pre-Islamic poetry was never existed, it was made up much later. Why is that dangerous? Because if you say that there was nothing called pre-Islamic poetry, that claim would lead to saying that the Quran is not a miracle. How? The Quran came as a challenge. If there was nothing to challenge, what's the point of, there is no miracle there, right? There was no miracle there. So if the Quran proved to Arabs that their excellent ability to write poetry can still be superseded by a divine text, and they were able, those Arabs who were masters of language, they appreciated the Quran. If there was nothing there, what would they have appreciated then? Right? So the Quran is a divine book and it's a sacred text. You gone?
It is His will, transcendent is He, that it should have a miraculous nature way beyond human capability.
Yeah.
Unlike other divine books, He took it upon Himself to preserve it because it is the final and all-comprehending divine address to mankind, containing the principles of divine guidance and the essence of all previous divine messengers.
So we can actually title this part of the text and call it the characteristics of the Quran. The characteristics of the Quran. A, it's a divine book, which means it's open-ended. There is no one who can claim that I really understand everything that's in the Quran. Why? Because to understand everything that's in the Quran, 100%, you have to be the divine himself. And secondly, it's a sacred text, which means that we have to contextualize it in as an speaking with authority. It's a sacred text because it speaks also with authority, and also that it includes what who is he? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he saw fit in the way of beliefs, legal rulings, good manners, organizational guidelines, and narratives. In other words, it included the Islamic worldview. So there is a Quranic worldview. The Quran, for example, sees this life as a journey to the hereafter, isn't it? As a temporary thing. Many people don't see life like this. They see life as an opportunity to accumulate money, to accumulate degrees, to accumulate status, to achieve as much as one could. The Quran doesn't see it in that way. The Quran sees it as a test. If someone doesn't see life as a test, then they will not expect from it difficulties. And if they don't, they will get frustrated. So the Quran has a Quranic worldview. But at the same time, the Quran has miracles, a miraculous nature, way beyond human capability. In other words, regardless of how intelligent humans can be, they will not be able to encompass the miraculousness of the Quran, because it breaks the laws that govern human nature, and at the same time it triggers questioning. So the point of a miracle, is not only it proves you that you are unable to, but it triggers your inquiry. When, for example, you see someone can walk on water, that's a miracle, because you've never seen someone doing that before, isn't it? And it proves that you are unable. But at the same time, what does it tell you? It triggers you to think. So what could have been the reason? What did he do to achieve that? Right? Imagine if the Prophet ﷺ did not go to Al-Quds and came back in one night. Human beings wouldn't have even thought of flying. So miracles teach us that there are laws, and these laws are broken now, but the breaking of these laws is possible. Is possible. Might not be now, but possibly in 50 years, possibly in 100 years, possibly in 200 years. If it happened once, why doesn't it happen twice? So it always triggers in the human mind inquiry about the future. So what are the limits of human achievements? What are the limits of human dreams? There is no limits for human dreams. But what are the limits of human achievements? So when the law is broken, there is mu'jiza. That is mu'jiza at a certain time, but it's not later on. For example, if someone is to say today that he traveled to Middle Eastern country and came back the same night, it's believable. If he has a private jet, he can go and come back in the same without any passport check or anything. It's doable. But if that was said, even the idea of flying to another country 200-300 years ago would be unbelievable, right? So what happens with the miraculous nature of the Quran is that it triggers our human inquiry, and it keeps us driving. Okay, so how the Quran is miraculous? It's possibly language. Okay, let's explore language. And then when you achieve your maximum in unveiling the linguistic beauty of the Quran, You say, I exhausted myself. And then it could be the legal, or could be the legal miracle that the Quran contains these amazing legal guidelines of a just and fair society. Okay, let me try to expound and expose that. And you try your best, and then in the end you say, well, I've exposed everything I could. Right? And what happens? With the passage of time, we will just come back to the Quran and say, you know what? Theorists and philosophers have discovered new theories of legal excellence, but the Quran actually has expounded this already. So what happens is, while it triggers human inquiry, it just shows you how limited the human inquiry can be. Yes, go on.
It was meant to be flexible and open-ended so that it can be addressed to the humanity of all times and places, unlike previous scriptures which were intended for specific circumstances.
So we said that the Quran is divine, it's sacred, it's miraculous, it's preserved. That's quality number 4. And also, it is flexible and open-ended. I mean by flexible and open-ended, if you read a text, a small paragraph, there is a multiplicity of ways of understanding that. You can understand it in this way, or this way, or this way, or this way, or this way. But to say that it's an open-ended text, meaning you can understand it for as many ways as you wish, no way. That doesn't apply to human texts. But with the Quran, you can read the Quran 1,000 times. And every time you read it, there is a new layer of meaning that can be understood.
So that there is a flow system, even while preparing the Quran for the greatest guidance of all, that is the Quran.
Yes.
The general and particular purposes of the Quran revolve around 4 major axes:
Yes.
guidance, miraculousness, and legal rules.
So these are very, very important. He will be talking about the 4 axes that the Quran has purpose to deliver. 1 is instruction, 2nd is guidance, 3rd is miraculousness, and finally is legal rules. I think inshallah in our next class we'll be expounding on the 4 of these. I would advise that you finish reading this part and reading number 1. Principle number 1 of Quranic, the influence of the relationship between Quran and the various sciences on defining the tools and sources of the exegetes. Inshallah, hope bi'idhnillahi ta'ala will be able to finish it next time. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.